got that. So I will go down here and we'll go to that. Play through. Good. So it always feels then like we've made a proper start, as we kind of now should be streaming. Just a quick kind of a thing right up front before we get going onto the text. Just got to get I've lost my text. Oh, there it is. Right. Okay. Yeah. Before we get going on the text. So we're actually I'm going to use today as a kind of the conclusion of this current run that we've been doing for these lunchtime Bible studies, which is a little bit early for Christmas, but the problem is we're coming to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. So it doesn't make sense to kind of totally start the next section of Matthew, because we'll be halfway through and then we'll all be disappearing around Christmas time. So we'll take a break till January, which is a shame because I quite enjoy doing them, but I know things are going to get a bit manic as we head towards the kind of Christmas period. A quick thing just to flag, Mike was just asking before we kind of went live. I was going to be doing a kind of a Christmas teaching series, but because of the other pressures and things that have happened in the family and so on, and we postponed that by a year. but what we will be doing is an online Advent calendar. So every day there'll be a little 3 to 4 minute quite fun video with a carol, a reading, an observation on Christmas in it. So that's just something to kind of mention at this stage as we kind of before we start. But let me pray, and then we'll look at Jesus's kind of drawing things together as he kind of concludes the Sermon on the Mount. So, Father, we just thank you for the time we've got. Father, we thank you. This is the message that you give us is both encouraging, but it's also challenging. And actually, as we understand more of the way that people are made up, we need things to be challenging for them to be satisfying. And so, Father, thank you that actually some of the Sermon on the Mount really is a challenge, but it is challenging in a way that brings hope and brings satisfaction. And so, Father, we just ask you to speak to us, feed us this afternoon. In Jesus' name, amen. And I just realized. Okay. So yeah, we're doing quite a few verses today. Matthew 7 verses 13 through to 29, which takes us right to the end, as I say, of the Sermon on the Mount. And what we're going to see is Jesus drawing together the kind of major themes and kind of setting up his disciples for what's going to come forwards, what's going to happen as we move on forwards. So I thought before we kind of actually get directly into the verses, I just thought it's worth kind of highlighting a kind of the flow of the structure of the verses we're going to look at. So we're going to see Jesus kind of in verses 13 to 14, we're going to see Jesus kind of summing together the way's narrow, it is tough. Then he kind of then warns about teachers as a sort of a stand-in for him. But those are wolf in sheep's clothing, because there are two kinds that are like that. There are those who are kind but don't have good fruit. There are kind who have some fruit. Oh, sorry, not they are kind. There is the kind of false teacher who has got no good fruit at all. And then there's also a kind of good teacher that has some fruit but doesn't have ethical growth alongside that fruit. There's also, he kind of highlights a sort of superficial way of responding to his words, and there's a deeper way of responding to his words, and there's a massive difference between the two. And then we have some final statements about Jesus' authority as the whole thing is drawn together by Matthew. So just kind of unpacking those things, we say it starts with so you enter through the narrow gate. So there is a kind of an admission in Jesus's words that what he has outlined, which has been covered by the 8 Beatitudes, the themes that we've looked at, mourning over sin, being meek, having your skills put in the right place, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, not because of the benefits you get in an earthly sense from them, because of the heavenly reward that's related to them. As he's talked about these things, the approach that we take in terms of our kind of our sexual makeup, that actually it's not just about not breaking the big taboos like committing adultery, but actually just the way we understand and approach each other. There is an admission by Jesus that this is a narrow gate. Now that's sometimes sort of disturbing. I say sort of disturbing, and it hits at one of the conundrums which is very hard to untangle in the New Testament. But proper scholarship all kind of recognizes it, but very often we ignore it because it's complex and we blur things into one. But what I mean by that is that there is a difference between the place of salvation and kind of authority in the kingdom. So for instance, Jesus regularly, we tend to see everything since the Reformation purely in terms of salvation or not salvation. We're saved by faith. Have you had a real experience of the Lord? Salvation. Are you going to heaven, in other words? But actually, a lot of what Jesus is teaching is actually from within that place, from that place of salvation. How do you press into authority, maturity, in a way that is really reflective of who Jesus is? And actually that process, and so there is a kind of within Scripture an implicit, and sometimes it's even explicit, but it's very, as you try and put these things together, if I kind of give you some surprise examples, for instance, we take the wise and foolish virgins. And the wise and foolish virgins have all been invited to the wedding feast, and at the end, those who haven't prepared, who haven't, if you like, taken seriously their calling, aren't kicked out of the wedding feast. They're at the edge of the wedding feast in outer darkness. Well, you see, in the ancient world, you come into a home to eat. It's often in a courtyard area. There's lots of light in there. And towards the edges, it gets darker. The lights aren't there. So if you're really in the in crowd, if you've made a success of it, you're in the middle. You're in the place where light is. If you've not made such a success of it, you're on the outside edge in outer darkness. That doesn't mean you've been kicked out of the whole thing. And it's just a kind of a quick example of how, as you kind of look at these things, there are these two kind of agendas going on. That we pick up as Paul goes on that salvation is by faith, and that's a basic foundation line. And then the question is, as Paul kind of plays it out, so let's sin that grace may abound. Well, that's not really what it's about, but somehow it's not the disqualification either. And so there's something of this that we've just got to get our head around as we read here. This is Jesus's message to disciples who've gone up the mountain with him. They've said, I want to push in. I want to understand this message at a deeper level. I'm not just looking at salvation. In the Jewish mindset, being born Jewish made you saved. So there was a big, broad scope of things in which being born Jewish has now given you salvation. But the question is, what do you do with that? What do you do with the privilege that is all about? And so we have to kind of keep that in mind. We won't try and always discern exactly, because people get into big arguments as to which one's which, what's about authority in the kingdom, what's about salvation. But just to be aware that it's there. So this entering through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. So enter through the narrow gates is a challenge. Come this way, come this narrow way. There is a wide way, and it leads to destruction. Now that would seem like this is now more to do with salvation, and there is a kind of I suppose a warning within the process that we can seem to be on the path, but we'll be totally missing it, and things kind of fall to pieces. While the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and those who find it are few. I do like the fact that Jesus uses the word "find it." Because actually there is an implicit thing that actually the finding and doing it on your own is very rare. But of course there is a wonderful thing which is part of the message, which is you can be shown a way. And probably there is a sense in which as we're in a larger community of those who are trying to find the way, it becomes slightly easier because you're not finding it for yourself. Others are kind of giving it to you, and there's a kind of a handing over in that process. But we do have this tension that there is something we're supposed to be growing in, that Jesus wants us to be growing in, that being a part of a disciple of his there are words and there are messages that he speaks to the masses. But for those who are right on the inside, there's something about the growth in the kingdom and the authority in the kingdom, and actually succeeding long term in this life, in living in God's purposes, not just for the one to come, that isn't going to be straightforward and easy. And that in many ways is a kind of reflection back on everything that we've had up to this point. So now Jesus starts to look forward because he starts to think about what's coming after. So he raises, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing. So they look like they're trying to be like you are, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. Now, he's already given us some hints of where they may be because he's challenged us. If you're doing righteousness, why are you doing it? Are you doing it because you're doing it for an audience? Are you doing the right things but in the wrong way? Those kinds of challenges. Are you being a hypocrite? He's used that word several times. And so now suddenly he's presenting a case where while he is this person presenting as a prophetic word, at this stage, his disciples are seeing him more as a prophet than as a Messiah. So, and there are people who are going to come who look like me. They look like you, but inwardly there's something different about them. We've been addressing some of those issues as we go through the Sermon on the Mount. And so he gives us this really straightforward and simple and actually incredibly profound, simple way of understanding it. It's not that you have to fully vet everybody from a theological point of view, because it assumes that you therefore are perfect theologically and you can do that. But actually there is a simple sense in which we tend to get people by their fruit. There are some people, and when I say there are some, there are often more than we would expect. There was I can't think of his name now. It was an Italian psychologist who made statements about what he called stupid people. It's very rude to call them stupid, but actually stupid people do stuff that is destructive to themselves and to other people. There are some people who do stuff that's destructive to other people, but is good for them. And he called those bandits. But there are those people who somehow do stuff that is just takes you down the whole time. The reason I mentioned him is the thing he was quite adamant about is there are more of those people than anybody likes to admit. Whether he's right or not, I don't know. He's not the gospel, but there is something about certain types of folks we do see becomes destructive, and so actually in this journey where the way is narrow and the path is kind of tight. It is important that we start to recognize, not just with leaders, but those around us, those who kind of are likely to drag us down. We have to take a certain level of responsibility for the company I keep, because growth is not straightforward. It can get sapped. I used to use a lot when we were in pastoral work. You'd refer to toxic friendships. Almost everybody has a friendship somewhere that's constantly dragging them down spiritually. It's just kind of a common phenomena. And actually, we do have to be real about those and how we manage them and how we try and create distance from ourselves. I try to remember where it comes from. I don't think it's a Jesuit thing. It's the kind of thing that Jesuits would say, though, which is you can see someone's future in the friends they keep in the present. That's a kind of one of those truisms of psychology that actually the fruit of those around us is quite a good predictor of how we're likely to stay on the journey or not. So Jesus kind of warns us with this very simple idea. It's not always what they say and express. They believe all the right things. They can quote the Westminster Catechism, but actually what's the fruitfulness in their lives? And there is a kind of a balance in this, because those who are more fruitful, it really does become more fruitful. You find people around them are doing better as well. So there's that simple little kind of that little criteria. It's not a piece of bad theology that means you're a bad person to be around if you're on this. It's something about the basic orientation, because there's so much that we can do that looks right, but the heart can be wrong. We cannot be someone who's committing adultery, but the heart is full of all sorts of desires and lusts and treating people as objects rather than as real people. We can look like we're doing a lot of praying, but actually we do it for the audience. We can do all of those sorts of things. And that deep thing is hard to identify, but a simple way of saying is, does it produce good fruit? A good tree can't grow bad fruit, and a bad tree can't grow good fruit. And every tree that doesn't grow good fruit is cut down or thrown in the fire. So in one sense, there's total types, aren't there? Apple trees on the whole are good unless it's gone rotten. But then there are things that are kind of poisonous and bitter, and we don't really eat what comes from those at all. So it's by your fruits you're going to know people. So make sure you have time with those who do you good, who feed you, who are beneficial to be around, who you can get stronger and encouraged by being with. Because not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father in heaven. So again, it's how do we balance this statement? Actually there's knowledge of Jesus. Is it permanent and eternal, or is it in this moment there's someone who's coming around saying, Lord, Lord? They're using the right language, but actually they're in a place where they are willfully outside of what God really wants for them. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? So there are those who are just unhelpful to be with. Now, there are some who seem like they're doing the right things. They've got a little bit of fruit, because didn't they prophesy? They may have even got those prophecies right. And in your name, didn't we drive out demons? And in your name, didn't we perform many miracles? And you can see a parallel with what Jesus is saying here with the words of Paul, when he says, you know, if I've got all wisdom and I can prophesy, but I don't have love, then what have I got? You know, and that there is something about that idea. There's an ethical transformation, which is more than the kind of the flash that we like. It's the flash that produces cash in the Christian world. You know, that actually, you know, I know the truth because I have seen real miracles. And I know that when you stand up and tell stories about those things, there are an awful lot of people who love those stories. And they probably give you a bit bigger gift if you come and tell those stories than if you talk about the slower, tougher personal development side, which can and can, even in our cynicism, we can turn that into, oh, you're proud because you've achieved it yourself. We don't want to be proud of anything that Jesus hasn't done for me. But actually, there is a thing of I want to follow the Lord with integrity. I understand I'll have mixed motives in doing it, but actually some of that growth it is not so obvious, but it is deeper, if I can put it that way. So however, I will tell them, and what I've done, just so you can see it, because I kind of reworked through with my interlinear translations and various other versions, and I've moved the lawless workers to being part of the statement. Greek doesn't have kind of quote marks, so you don't know. So I've made it a qualification of those that Jesus is teaching. So however, I will tell them, those lawless workers. And we often have things like workers of iniquity, but the concept is people who are doing stuff outside of law, the Greek word. So so some translations will put things, those workers of lawlessness, things like that. I've gone for lawless workers. I'll tell those lawless workers. In other words, they're people who are doing stuff for God, but somehow they have lost the fact that there is an inner ethical transformation that the Lord is looking for. It's the law that is to be written in our hearts. It's not just the external law which we submit ourselves to, but there's a law that I write your words in my heart that you might not sin against me. That actually there are those who get busy with the stuff of the kingdom, the prophesying, the healing, doing all sorts of things, but actually in their hearts, they've not submitted themselves to law, this transformational process. So those lawless workers, I never knew you, depart from me. And we get the kind of the clue here that there's something about, because we always get fearful. Then I say a lot of people will get fearful. Am I a lawless worker? Is it me that's lawless? Actually, the key thing we've got to recognize is that sense of, do we feel near to Jesus, or does he feel distant from us? That actually there is a place where something of that sense of distance is actually a reflection on whether we're really keeping our hearts submitted to him, to allow him to do that kind of process in us. Because not everyone who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man. So that word not shouldn't be there. That was where I was copying and pasting. I obviously left the not from a previous. It should just say, so everyone who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the torrents came, and the winds blew and beat upon the house. I love that little phrase. Jesus uses slightly different verbs and nouns in that phrase. You can really feel the drama. The rain fell, the torrents came, the winds blew and beat upon the house, but it didn't fall, because its foundation was on the rock. So these things, because Jesus is going to teach a whole lot of other stuff. See, there's a whole lot of other stuff that Jesus teaches. He teaches the apocalyptic sermon, which makes us all very good at spotting evil. He preaches parables of the kingdom. He teaches parables about how to do mission. He preaches a lot, but this really what he's drawing together, this is the summation of the Sermon on the Mount, is this something of this inner change, this transformational change that is the rock that becomes the foundation stone. But it doesn't fall because its foundation is on the rock. If we try and keep ourselves accountable out of the closeness of the relationship with these ideas, which are a radical retake, a review of the 10 Commandments, which are put in terms of the external constraints on sin, to actually now push us towards the roots in the heart that will produce and grow in a healthy way. If we stay with that, we try and make that our foundation, we try and keep it there with the right motives, then there's that kind of promise that somehow what you do, even when you get buffeted, the foundation will basically stay strong. And then the contrast, but everyone who hears these words of mine but doesn't do them is just like that foolish man who built his house on sand. And it's sad you read these words, because I'm sure if anyone's been in pastoral ministry, you every single person who's ever done anything in pastoral ministry will know so many folks who become like that foolish. It's kind of, grace has covered me, that's okay, I'm covered by grace, it's not by works, I've done this, well, I'm not really bothered about that. Now, I'm not saying one failure and everything falls, but it's actually the way in which we treat it trivially, if I can put it that way. Remember that one of the last things we looked at is those who mourn over sin, who take their own sin seriously, who are pointing the finger, suddenly realize that there's three fingers pointing back at them, and they need to remove the plank from their own eye to see clearly if they're going to be helping others. There's something about taking what the damage and brokenness of sin seriously, which means that you can, if you're like that, even sometimes when you fail, you get up again because you're trying to keep it in that place, rather than that kind of casual approach, which is quite common. I think Jesus anticipates it right from the beginning, that we've turned the grace into licentiousness, as Paul would kind of put it. And we know that people who live those ways, and actually things do crash. The rain fell, the torrents came, the winds blew and beat upon the house, and it fell, and its collapse was massive. The actual Greek word is mega. The collapse was mega. So it really is a big, everything kind of tends to fall down. They hold it together, but I can casually do this. I can be a bit dishonest. Even as I sit here today, without wanting to be judgmental, because I'm aware of folks who I know who aren't that, who in their workplace aren't that honest, and will say, well, it's difficult to be honest. And I understand that it is difficult sometimes to be honest in the workplace, and sometimes there might be times when you have to because of your sales or whatever. But actually, if you treat that casually, and you don't, it doesn't seem to be much of an instinct, we suddenly find we're on the broad road rather than the narrow road. And so we shouldn't be surprised when suddenly everything falls. And very often at that point, the foundations of people's faith don't seem as sure as they used to. So there is a kind of a dire warning, not to kind of not to set people up to fail, but to see there is a real consequence to not trying to do this the right way. Its fall is massive. So when Jesus finished these things, the crowd were amazed at his teaching. Now remember, the whole of the Sermon on the Mount has been predicated by the idea of the kingdom of God. And righteousness, the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. This is about pushing into something of the authority and purpose of the life that God has thought for us. It's coming under his authority, his kingship, and salvation is an element of that, but it's not the summation of all of that. Salvation is much more basic. The kingship of God in our lives reflects that actually I'm living as his subject with the authority that brings, and so And so how we understand and disentangle those two issues, the kingdom and salvation, the gospel of the kingdom or the gospel of salvation, those are slightly different things. The Bible talks a lot more about the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, rather than the gospel of the kingdom, rather than the gospel of salvation. Salvation is the first step in the process. So when Jesus finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he talked with his own authority and not as their scribes. I've gone with the word own there. It's an implied word. It's because he taught with his authority. I've emphasized it with the word own. He taught with authority. And not as their scribes. But the part of the reason for using it is because if you actually look at the scribal writings, and we've done that, we've kind of thought as we've gone through the Sermon on the Mount, we've noticed how the Sermon on the Mount has referenced the Hillelites, the Shammaites, is referenced the Essenes, is referenced some of the intertestamental writings. He's referenced there's a whole load of other teachers and scribes, and actually one of the things that marks them out is that they are so obfuscating, the other scribes. They it's kind of like, well, I'm about to tell you this, but let me point out that so and so said this, and so said that, and so said this, and this person agreed with me, so now I'm telling you, so sort of you agree with me, but if you disagree with me, you're also disagreeing with all these other people. I've surrounded myself with so many cross references to other people. And so actually this idea of his own authority is the simplicity with which Jesus is making it. This is not because so-and-so said it and so-and-so agreed with him and so-and-so was more important than another person and I've given you 15 references. This is authority. This is me saying it as it is, if I can put it that way. And because he taught his own authority and not as their scribes, and that's the end of the chapter. And probably the next verse of the first chapter is kind of the transition where it says now he comes down off the mountain. But actually, if you take these final two verses, the last comment on them. So when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed. Now notice there wasn't a crowd with Jesus up the mountain at the beginning. I think this is kind of saying this was the first time Jesus started to unpack his ethical agenda. Was the time he goes up the mountain and the disciples come to him. During this first phase, as they're going out, I suspect this teaching is being regularly revisited, which is what, as we saw in Luke's gospel, we find a very similar sermon to the Sermon on the Mount, slight differences and put at a slightly different period. It's at the end of his first tour. So I suspect that these things are stuff that even as Jesus has come down, and this is the first time it's been laid out to his original group of disciples, he starts to put those out initially to see who it attracts, who this tough message is going to attract. And it draws in others. I suspect some of the 72 get drawn in during this first phase, you know. So actually by the crowds is plural. So Jesus finished saying things, the crowds, it's not the crowd. So I think this is almost a kind of a post sermon summary. So Jesus finished saying these things, we've heard them. Now actually as he went on saying those things, as we kind of the crowds were amazed at his teaching and because of his authority, which is not like the scribes. So we're now at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. We've seen its challenges, we've seen its incredible kind of hope. We see this kind of this balance, which is there are things that we somehow need to get hold of and keep working at, which is not the antithesis of grace. It's a consequence of grace. It's what grace is for. To kind of put it in Old Testament terms, you know, the children of Israel leave Egypt, so they're saved from. But it's not until they kind of push in 30 years later, isn't it, that they discover what they're saved for. There is a kind of a transition between being saved from and saved for. And actually the Sermon on the Mount gets right at the heart of this process, this reinterpretation of the law that Jesus has given us, that actually as we internalize it and we submit ourselves to it, so we're not people of lawlessness, then actually we grow in the things of God, but in God's way, not in our way, if I can put it that way. So those are my thoughts on this final kind of section of the Sermon on the Mount. Does anyone want to kind of comment or raise any ideas or ask any questions? at this stage. We always get that that wonderful silence that comes with Zoom.
I'll put in a comment that I remember my father always used to bring out, talking about the wise man and the foolish man building his house on the sand. We tend to think of it as being, building it on the beach. Why on earth would you do that? My father used to point out that he's probably building it on a dried up riverbed.
Uh-huh.
If you build in a riverbed, you should not be surprised if when the rain comes and the floods come downstream, you are in the way.
Yeah.
It does remind me of some people building housing estates on floodplains and then wondering why they get flooded.
Yeah.
Blaming global warming or divine retribution on sheer foolishness.
Yeah.
Not much water for me, if you'll pardon the pun.
No. And the funny thing is, Stephen, I was going to say funny. I saw these little YouTube videos popped up the other day, which was 5 engineering disasters, and one of them was this enormous thing that they built in this, and they got about halfway up, so it was half built. It's in New York, and they discovered that actually one of the piles wasn't on bedrock; it was on just mud and sand.
Mm-hmm.
And so they actually, because it was in New York, of course, it had to be dismantled the floor at a time. They couldn't just kind of blow it up and have it all kind of crash down. But the thing is, you see the pictures of it, it's suddenly getting very high because it starts to tilt. And it was already at something like 40 centimeters off by the top when they were about halfway up. And so you think these issues, they're very real illustrations. People still do it. They still don't survey properly.
It's been going on for a long time. And when I was in Mexico City, the cathedral there in the main plaza, the Zócalo, downtown Mexico City, is built on the old lake of Tenochtitlan.
Right.
Because when the conquistadores arrived in Mexico, of course, the Aztec empire there was a series of causeways to
right.
the center of the lake. And the Spanish drained it all and then started to build basically on the floodplain.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a very real illustration, isn't it? It does happen. It does happen. Yeah.
No accounting for foolishness.
No, there isn't. But any other comments or thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the Sermon on the Mount is something that I tend to gloss over because it's very nice. Yeah, blessed are these and blessed are they. And I think, I want to get into John's gospel and I want to get into the Acts and the epistles. And so to slow down and to get a feel for some of these things, I'm finding helpful on that. So I'm going to have to go back and look at these. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think the challenge of growth is always awkward. That's why I'm saying it kind of is nice when we think, oh, we're all going to grow, but actually the process of growth is often quite a painful thing. We actually talk about growing pains because when teenagers grow fast, they can sometimes get pains with them. It's just I'm being stretched, and that's why I often find it's a kind of it's a double-edged sword, the Sermon on the Mount. There's some things that I think, wow, fantastic, and other things I'm thinking, great, I've got to apply that to me. But we it's really key in many ways that we understand the whole communication of God in its fullness, which is actually a message of grace with challenge in it, and the challenge becomes a hope because actually it's surrounded by that grace. Yeah. Good. Any other thoughts or comments as we're coming towards the end of our time? No. No. Good. Well. So it's sad to say. Then we'll have a few weeks off now. I was saying, Stephen, I think you weren't here right at the beginning, because we come to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. This is a good point probably to make a break. It's a couple of weeks earlier than I intended to, but it doesn't seem sensible to start a whole new section of Matthew, do a couple of weeks and then kind of leave it halfway through. So we'll kind of pick things up in the new year and take a slightly extended break for the run up to Christmas, which gives people more freedom to use their lunch times to get those things organized. And actually in a funny way to do something which I think it may not be verbally the same as the Sermon on the Mount, but in principle is the same, which is we want to celebrate something that's really, we have something worth celebrating. It's not an empty celebration. So much of what the world does is celebrating for the sake of celebrating, rather than actually seeing we've got something that's worth celebrating. So let's make it sacred by making it special. So we'll leave some space for us to make our reasons for celebration really special. So I will, as I say goodbye today, it will be for a few weeks, but hopefully people will rejoin me in the new year. So I will say my goodbyes.
And it's goodbye from him.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's goodbye from him. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Okay, see you, Stephen and Anne.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Yeah, see them. Bye, Anne.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
Mike. Good. And Neil, of course, has disappeared already. I'll say goodbye as well.